Another evening at City Lights. Welcome, everyone. I am your host, Peter Maravellis. For those of you online, welcome, watching from all over the world. Just want to let you know we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people. I want to take a moment to pay our respects to those who came before us as stewards of the land. So it is such a delight to have Margaret Juhae Lee with us here tonight, celebrating this amazing new book, Starry, a memoir of lost history, published by our friends at Melville House, which is one of the great indie presses. Starry combines investigative journalism, oral history, and archival research to explore a family's lost history. So Margaret presents a compelling story of a grandfather she never knew, weaving together the stories of her family against the backdrop of Korea's tumultuous modern history. Margaret Juhae Lee is an Oakland-based writer and former literary editor of The Nation magazine. Her articles and reviews and interviews have been published in The Nation, Newsday, Elle, Art News, The Progressive, amongst others. She was named Person of the Year by the Sangchul Cultural Welfare Foundation in South Korea for her work honoring her grandfather. So with us tonight is also Eirinie Carson. Eirinie is a member of the Writers Guild here in San Francisco. She's a frequent contributor to Mother Magazine, and her work has also appeared in Mother Muse, You May Need to Hear This, and the Sonora Review. She is also a regular contributor to the Argus Courier via her column Eirinie Asks. Melville House published her book, The Dead Are Gods. She is currently working on her second novel. So such a pleasure to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Mic check, mic check. Hi.
Hi, Eirinie.
Hi, Margaret. This is so fun. I sound a little fuzzy to me. Do I sound fuzzy to you? Oh, okay. Like this? That's much better. Less aggressive is what you're telling me. This is nice. This is like a very formal version of our coffee that we had last week.
Yes,
there's more flowers and more people looking at us, but that's all right. I just wanted to say that I'm really honored to be here with you today. Your book is so beautiful. It centers on your grandfather, Chul Ha, and the secrets buried within a family tree and the healing that can be brought from confronting the history. It's a book about belonging and reconciliation and discovery, but also grief. And it begins with a scene of your grandfather's reburial, and I wondered if you might speak a little to this chapter and maybe read from it.
Sure. This chapter is set in I'm really bad with dates. I think it's 1995, and this is the reburial ceremony where my grandfather's grave was moved to the National Cemetery in Daejeon, South Korea, and he was named a patriot of the country for his activities as a student revolutionary protesting Japanese rule during the colonial era. So I will read the chapter to you. It's called Reburial, and I have to find it. My grandfather, Chul Ha, is being buried again today. October 12th, 1995, in the Daejeon National Cemetery in South Korea, almost 60 years after he was buried the first time. That time, in 1936, my great-grandfather watched as the remains of his 27-year-old son were laid to rest in a mountain site he had originally reserved for himself. This time, uniformed military officers stand in salute, paying homage. This time, Korea exists as an independent country, albeit cut in two and not a colony of Japan. This time, his eldest son, daughter-in-law, granddaughter, and grandson are in attendance, fresh from a trans-Pacific flight from the United States. This time, my grandfather will be buried in honor and not in shame. In the funeral photograph, the only photograph we have of him, the 19-year-old grandfather I never knew is devastated at being caught. Eyelids heavy with fatigue, hair shorn by him or his captors. I don't know. The lack of hair accentuates his squared-off forehead, a family trait handed all the way down to my brother Ed, recently graduated from college, who is the same age as our grandfather was in the photograph. It is Ed who carries our grandfather's framed image today under the searing early fall sun. My father discovered my grandfather's photograph in 1992 with the help of an old college mate, or to be exact, with the help of a graduate student of an old college mate from Seoul National University. The original black and white image, now blown up to a portrait size, measured approximately 2 by 3 inches, the standard ID for all occupants of the Sodaemun Hyungmuso, the prison reserved for political prisoners during the Japanese occupation. Forlorn, bereft. My grandfather's wide shoulders slumped forward, causing his loose tunic to gape at the neck. Residual baby fat weighs down his cheeks. The corners of his closed mouth turn downward. The lettering on the sash across his chest has been erased. My father covered it with whiteout. I asked my father why he altered the photo as we walk up the grand staircase behind Ed to the top tier of the cemetery. It wouldn't be proper, he whispers. I start to argue with him. Was he trying to save face in front of the relatives to hide the fact that we were using my grandfather's mugshot as his funeral photo? Did he still feel shame about his father's prison stay and the fact that he was a communist? My mother grabs my hand and widens her eyes, the signal for me to shut my mouth. No arguing in front of the relatives. She had already fussed at me on the car ride over for wearing the pants of my royal purple silk suit and not the skirt, which I ditched because I didn't want to wear pantyhose in the heat. The soldiers lead the procession and stop in front of the open row of grave sites to twirl their rifles in unison. Their staccato shouts drift over the valley below as they march off and allow the families to gather in front of the graves of their ancestors. I try to catch my brother's eye, to give him a silent pep talk, but his gaze is cast downward. I can tell he is nervous, tentative, worried that he might do the wrong thing and embarrass the family in some way. My father whispers in Ed's ear. Sweating in his black wool suit, Ed places our grandfather's photograph on a low table covered in white fabric. He turns around and looks toward my father for further guidance. My father holds up 2 fingers. Ed lowers his 6'2" frame to his hands and knees and bows his head in front of the picture. He stands and bows again. My father and all of the surviving male members of the family follow his example. My mother and I, as well as the other female family members, stand behind the men, as is the custom. 2 days before, my grandfather's bones were exhumed from the family burial plot high in the mountains surrounding the city of Gyeongju. The grandfather I never knew exists in the here and now as a skeleton, an archaeological artifact excavated from a disintegrating wooden coffin. Resurrected, reborn, for a second chance at commemoration. A young man's bones transformed into a relic of an era no one wanted to remember until now. His modeled skeleton is encased in a shiny silver coffin covered with the South Korean flag, which has been placed behind the low table on which his photograph rests.
Thank you so much. I think that's such a beautiful entrance into the story of your discovery about your grandfather. And I recognize so much, as also a writer about grief, I recognize so much of that kind of echoing through that passage in particular. And I wondered, did you feel like you were confronting kind of grief and mourning as you went through this?
Yeah, definitely. It was, I think at first when I went to Korea and I saw my grandfather's bones being exhumed, it almost felt like a archaeological dig. Because I never knew him, so I didn't have an emotional connection. But when his bones were moved to the National Cemetery, that's when I felt the gravity of what was happening. So the first time he was buried, he was a 27-year-old man. And, he was so young. And then finally he gets to be buried in honor, because the first time he was buried, he was considered a criminal. And his family was ashamed of him. So I definitely felt that at the ceremony. So I'm grieving a person that I never knew. It's a weird feeling.
You describe the catch-22s of being a member of the diaspora so well. There's a very small passage. Let's see if I can elegantly find it in all my post-it notes. I labeled them all.
Oh, nice.
We've lost it now. Bear with me. Where are you from? Houston. No, where are you really from? Houston. I'm from Houston. I grew up there. No, really, tell me where you're from. I am sure there are many people in this room who can identify with that line of interrogation. It's like a foot in two worlds, but questioned in both. And I wonder if your journey to research your ancestors and write this book led to any kind of unification of your identity as a member of the Korean diaspora?
I think so. I mean, it's one thing about growing up in Texas in the 70s and 80s. I never felt like I was an Asian American because there just weren't that many people of Asian descent where I grew up. And it wasn't an identity to me. I was treated, me and my parents were treated like foreigners. We were never treated like Americans. So it wasn't until I moved to California that I discovered what Asian American really meant. And that's when I think felt that way. And I think before that, I don't know what I identified as. So it was such a relief to come here and see so many other Asian Americans and people not questioning me like that.
Yeah.
That was not a daily occurrence like it was in Texas.
Yeah. And you spoke briefly in our coffee meeting about the kind of barrier when you were in Korea that you didn't initially speak Korean fluently. And I wonder if you can speak to how it feels now, having been Person of the Year and received these this recognition of your work and in turn your family's history.
I still feel a little guilty for not really speaking Korean, but but I'm accepting because and my parents are gone now, so my language skills have really deteriorated. But I feel like I'm at least, I feel Korean on the, because of my family's history. And I'm accepting that I will never really be fluent because I'm 57 years old and I just don't think it's going to happen.
I respect that. Another really beautiful motif that happens with your parents and when you're telling stories about your grandparents, and also a little bit with you and maybe your kids, is the two realities of our parents' lives, the ones we saw some of and then invented the rest of, and the ones that contain their interior lives. I know, and I'm sure that you do too, the duality of being a parent and also a fully formed human being. We are one solid, dependable thing to our children, whilst containing multitudes. With your discovery of your grandfather's life as a communist and a revolutionary, you probe another subject that our parents and forefathers have lived have lived lives that existed in galaxies long before we did. Is there anything you hope your children will see of you when they read this book?
Well, they're right here. Do you want to? One of the main reasons I see now, looking back, why I started this book and went on this journey to look for family history is to feel closer to my father as an adult. I think we really grew apart in adulthood. I was very, very close to him as a child, and then puberty hit, and I didn't want to have anything to do with him. And us together going on this journey made us feel closer, but also made me realize like what he endured as a child. Like he never talked about growing up in colonialism, when I was growing up. He barely talked about the war. And when he did talk about the war, he said, this is why my high school was postponed, because a war happened, and then it was for 3 years he didn't go to high school. So that was like the context of the war. It wasn't about we were displaced, we were hungry, none of that was discussed. But it made me realize like what he went through as a child and as a young person, and what he gave up to come to this country, and maybe how he felt like he didn't belong in Korea in some way because he didn't have a father, and he always had this like veil of shame. So I think that was one of the reasons why he came to the US. He was the first person in the family to come to the US in 1962, which is very early for Korean immigrants. As to my children who are sitting right here in the front row, I hope when they read the book that they can see that their mother is not just the person who tells them what to do, but a real person who had who had trials and tribulations and argued with her parents, and
went to new wave clubs.
I went to new wave clubs.
That's my favorite new tidbit about Margaret. So jazzed about this.
Well, I was pre-med, and like it wasn't a good combo. And to just see that.
I'm sure many surgeons were doing it. I'm sure
that their mother was a young person like they are. So
I'm sorry to put you guys on the spot. Can feel you shrinking. At times your book reads like fiction, other times memoir, other times interview. It adds such a wonderful texture, and I think it's really what drove me turning the pages. This kind of, it added a pace and an excitement, and a multi-dimensionalness. Here in my notes there's a better word, I'm sure, but I didn't find it apparently. You include interviews with your grandmother, and so much of it seems to be direct quotes. Was there a reason you decided to move between styles? Was it your journalistic background?
I think that's part of it. With my grandmother's interviews, I interviewed her 3 times, and we went through different parts of her life, and I wanted her voice to be captured rather than me interpreting what happened, like me putting to scene what she endured. I wanted to have her voice, her words explain her own life. And I felt like that was the most powerful way to convey that. And also it was the first time she ever shared any of those stories of her childhood, of her arranged marriage, of the time she went to visit my grandfather in prison. She never talked about that time in her life to anyone in the family. And I was the first person that she revealed any of that to, mostly because I told her it was for my career. She did not want to talk to me at all. She's like, this is painful. Why do you want to know? And I was like, Grandma, I want to write a book. I'm a journalist. She's like, okay. So that was the impetus. But once she started, she couldn't stop. It was really interesting. Just like, these stories just poured forth, and my father had heard none of them before. And it was interesting because my father could not be in the room. He had to be in a different room. She would not speak with my father there. And I think part of her felt a little guilty for not sharing this, or felt some of her own shame. And so he had to hide in the other room, and he was listening the whole time. But it was me and my mother who were speaking to her. The part about combining styles, when I began this book, I was a journalist. I was working at The Nation. I had graduated from journalism school at NYU, and I knew how to interview. I knew how to do research, but I didn't necessarily know how to instill myself into the story. They don't teach you that in journalism school. They don't, they teach you not to put I in the story. So that was the hardest part for me to do. So I think that's why there's so many different styles.
Well, you did it really beautifully, and I loved the glimpses of Margaret, high school Margaret, and college Margaret, and Margaret going to a Korean film festival, and he loved it also. Yes, San Francisco is a big fan. How many interviews did you do total with your grandmother?
I did 3 long form interviews, and then my mother did some interviews on her own. And we recorded all of them before her death. So my grandmother was 90 when she spoke to me.
Like a tape recorder?
Tape recorder. Yeah. This was 20 years ago. So we didn't have phones for everything. And research was much more difficult. Not everything was online. I had to ask history professors, and it was a very different time.
I think that's one of my favorite lasting images from the book is you interviewing the women together, interviewing your grandmother, and then your father kind of in an alcove out of the room, listening intently, because these are the first crumbs he's ever received from his mother about his father. And I love that image so much. And just you so deftly kind of peel back some of the layers of your grandmother, who seemed like maybe a difficult person to do that to. And I just loved that, getting to the truth of it and hearing her words. And it's almost like a reframing of the entire history that you get through her story.
Definitely. And I just want to say, that was the first time I really got to know my grandmother, was through those interviews. Like, she would come every 4 or 5 years to live with us, and my Korean wasn't great. Her English wasn't great. She was always reading the Bible, and it was a little, we didn't have a very close relationship. Plus, she was very stern and a little bit scary. I think she's tough grandma, not warm, fuzzy grandma. So, those interviews are the first time I felt really close to her and really understood what she endured and why she was the way she was. I mean, she was so tough because she had to be. She survived for over 90 years. She had to raise 2 kids by herself. She had to, she's displaced by the war, all these stories. And it was really her, her stories about survival and the survival of her family. Like, that really touched me.
Yeah, I feel like she's almost the secret hero of this story. I think your grandfather is on the cover. He is what we talk about when we talk about the blurb of your book. And yet at the heart of this book is your grandmother, who kind of held it together and is probably the reason that we're here today.
Right.
What do you think she would think about this, being a hero, being in a book?
I don't think she would say that she was a hero. I think she would just be like, oh, whatever, you're being silly. She was very stubborn. I mean, one thing in the reburial scene that I didn't get to was that my grandmother refused to go to the reburial. She was the only one in the family who wouldn't go. At the last minute, she said, I'm not going. And because she hadn't come to terms with this man who was her husband, who left her a widow with 2 babies to live, to raise herself. And I think part of her really hated him, because she thought of, that this is why my life has been so hard. And for her to, yeah, it would have been interesting if she had seen the, this published. Yeah, I don't know. I think she would just be dismissive, like whatever. How's your job? Are you making money? That would be the question.
Obviously, you detail your journey to create this book over the course of 30 years, but I'm curious, what was the very genesis of this book? What was the first thing you wrote for it?
I wrote some really bad chapters that I don't quite remember, but the first chapter that really came out was about my great uncle Chung. He was a chestnut farmer in my father's hometown, and I interviewed him because he's one of the few family members who are still alive who knew my grandfather. And what I realized from the interview and from my father telling me is that my great uncle was actually a member of the North Korean army, and he had come down south to recruit people and got stuck there during the war. And he had an entire family in North Korea. He had a wife and 3 children, and he never saw them again. He never was reunited, and he ended up marrying a local woman who was came from a farming family, and then he became a farmer. And he never spoke about this family again. And that, unfortunately, is a story common in many Korean families who just happen to be in the wrong side of the border at during a war where you don't know what's going to happen. And that separation is very common in Korean families. But I had no idea until my father told me. I mean, I interviewed him and I asked him. He would not tell me that he was a North Korean soldier because his wife was sitting there and looking at him and like, you better not talk about that stuff, because she felt very threatened about this other family that he had. So that was the first chapter I wrote. And I think it was easier for me to write because I was the observer. I was the, journalist coming in and uncovering the story. And that chapter is still pretty intact, but the rest of the book, I think is totally different from those first. Yeah.
Interesting. I wouldn't have assumed that. You write of your father that he said, "I never heard these stories before of his mother. I never knew she was so sick as a kid or how much she wanted to learn but couldn't. He looks at me, his eyes moist. As a kid, I asked her about the past, but she would never tell me." This, to me, is the takeaway of your entire book. These stories all of our families have often lost to the next generation, and you're here uniting your family with this long forgotten past. And I just think it's such an important gift, particularly in this time where we are trying to hold the pain of the past into the future so that we might learn from it. And that's just a thought I had for you.
Yeah,
from me to you.
Definitely. I mean, that's a major theme of the book. And I didn't realize exactly why I was writing the book until I had kids. And I knew that I was writing it for them, so they would know about the past, which is, their family's past, the history of Korea, where their grandparents and great grandparents came from. Because for me, it was just a hole. It was an absence. And I think that absence contributed to my feeling kind of lost and not feeling at home anywhere. I mean, there's other external forces too, but I wanted my kids to know, have these family stories and have family narratives so they could feel more rooted. So it's for you guys.
There were definitely several moments throughout the book where I realized, particularly with Chung's the chapter with Chung, that I'm reading something that would have been lost to me for certain. I would never have known about this man's life, and and you carry these stories with such care and clarity throughout the book, as you will all realize as you read it. Does it feel weighty to kind of carry this legacy on?
Definitely. And I think that's one of the reasons why it took so long for me to write, over 20, 25 years. The weight of history is very heavy, and especially if it's a traumatic history. And when I started this book, I had never heard the term generational trauma, and I think most people hadn't at that time. But that's what I was carrying, the trauma of imperialism, of my grandfather being tortured in prison, war. And that's why, my grandmother never wanted to talk about it, which, makes sense. But yeah, I definitely had to take breaks. And also part of me, when I started, I felt like I wasn't honoring the story. And I felt like me being a journalist and writing like a journalist wasn't the story I wanted to tell. Like I didn't have the tools to really dig in and write about myself. And it took me a while to figure out how to write that story.
What do you credit to as the thing that kind of helped you kind of get through the journalistic habit into something else?
Reading a lot of novels, and also like I needed time to digest the material, I think. So after my kids were born and I was in preschool, I started going to generative writing workshops where you actually write with a group of people, and the workshop leader will give you a prompt, and you just write what is immediate without taking the pen off the page. So no editing, just flow. And what came out was the book, totally rewritten book. And I had enough time to kind of digest the material and my grandmother's interviews and understand what the emotional arc was. And also I had the time to, I was a mother now. I was in a different part of my life. And so I could look back on my single life and kind of understand what I was doing. So I think I needed that time to
get to that part.
Yeah.
So this is a very timely book right now. It felt to me anyway. There were several pages that as someone who's been paying attention to the news, I underlined a lot of stuff. And I feel like it's kind of a mirror of a struggle that we're having now. There's a lot of assonance there. What do you think that we can learn from your grandfather's fight as a freedom fighter here in 2024?
I think there are a lot of lessons. I mean, imperialism still exists. It might not be called the same thing, but it's the same thing. Wars still exist. I mean, there's so many lessons from history that are not being learned or even acknowledged. There's genocide happening and nobody wants to call it that. There's many lessons to be learned. I mean, this is a continuum of things that happen, over 100 years in many, many, many countries. So it's still happening.
I felt like a lot of, as you kind of reconcile the truth of what your grandfather's life was, and in turn your grandmother's and your father's life, I felt that there was still a lot of hesitance in when you were in Korea to kind of have certain things acknowledged, even in some of the more contemporary chapters. Is that an accurate observation?
Definitely. I mean, my father never wanted me to say my grandfather was a communist. He's like, you can't say that. And I was like, well, Dad, he was a member of the Communist Party. It's like, that's the most communist you can be, is to be, but, at the time it was 2000, I mean, we're still kind of in the Cold War, but it was, to a certain generation of Korean, it's still anathema to be a communist. And I thought it was really cool. I was like, yeah, I mean, me being the progressive leftist I am. But it was very interesting when I was looking for my grandfather's records in Korea. I thought they would be in a library or an archive or at a university, and they weren't. Everywhere I went, I would go to all these records archives, and they said, "Oh, well, those records from 1929, they were all destroyed during the war. They don't exist." And I would get this over and over again. And I would talk to history professors who were studying that era. And finally, I met one that said, "Oh, well, actually, I got these records from some a revolutionary who was in my grandfather's group from this private publisher, this mysterious man, Mr. Shim. And you can go visit him, and maybe he might have the records that you need, but you might have to bring money." So is this like, I'm like, okay, like,
Like a black market.
yeah, it was like just like, I don't know what's going on. So I went there, and it turned out he had all of my grandfather's prison records, and he did not steal them. I thought he might have, I thought it was a little shady. But what had happened is that the records from the colonial era at that time, around 2000, they were seen as dangerous because they implicated very prominent families, Korean families, the ones who run Hyundai and Samsung and the Chaebols, as collaborators with the Japanese. And so nobody wanted to deal with them because it put a bad light on very powerful people. I mean, now I know that all of these records are in an archive. So we're kind of moved past that era. But at the time, that was the reason why they weren't in the library. And so Mr. Shim, he had a friend who worked in the Seoul Municipal Court and said, there's a bunch of records just sitting in the basement. I mean, literally just stacked, and some of them are wet and some of the rats have eaten. Do you want to go down there and just take pictures of them? And that's what he did. And those happened to be my grandfather's records, and then the records of his comrades that who were arrested at the same time. So that's where I found it, is through the mysterious private publisher who wasn't too janky.
Yeah, I mean, he still required a briefcase of cash, but yeah. Yeah, you did. I mean, so many little twists of fate that made sure that this history was in your hands. It feels very right that you wrote a book, that we're here in City Lights, that we're celebrating you tonight with this book, and in turn your entire family, including the future ones. You include a lot of photos in this memoir, which I love, and I wondered if there were any that you kind of were leaving out, any you chose to leave out of the collection.
There was a limit to how many they could put in. I think it was 20. Most of the historical ones, I mean, we have very, very few pictures of my grandmother as a young woman, or my grandfather. We have his prison picture. And then I discovered later there's one more picture of him after he was released, and he looks like a totally different person. He's emaciated. He's very sickly. So we have 2 pictures of my grandfather. Some of the more recent pictures we did not include, family pictures. But mostly it's we have the same editor, Carl. Carl was in charge of picking the pictures. So
I'll bring it up with Carl if there are any that I would have liked to see.
Printed nicer on the paper than the color. So that was part of
I have a couple of last minute, like, just fun questions for my own satisfaction. Does the Bay Area still feel transitory to you?
A little bit. I mean, my family's here.
Everyone's feeling very nervous.
So
everyone's like, wait, what?
It's the Bay Area is a weird place, right? I mean, we all live here, right? And maybe I don't think I feel at home any place. It's like with the people I'm with. I feel at home with these people.
Yeah.
People and just friends. And
I think that's
So-
something that's really apparent in your writing, that you're kind of bouncing around to these different cities and living in different places, but there is
Mhm.
one constant, and that is your like chosen family.
Right, right.
They're very living large in the scene. I feel like I'm surrounded by them as we
Yes.
speak.
Yes, I have high school friends here. I have college friends here. Yeah,
Nice.
it's really
I'm
nice.
excited to put some of the dancing
yeah.
queens along, like face with a name. Are they the dancing ones over there? Um, they're pointing at each other. Well, Margaret, I want to make sure that we have time for questions. Thank you so much for this beautiful book. I'm so honored to have been here with you tonight.
Thank
And I'm
you.
honored to also, I believe in one way that we grieve is to say our dead ones' names aloud.
Mm.
And I feel like you've done it with this book, and your grandfather
Oh,
and grandmother and mother and father can live on. So yeah, thank you so much, Margaret.
oh, thank you, Eirinie. Thanks.
So the way we're going to conduct the Q&A is that's the longer mic, and I'm going to try to get it as close to you as possible, but you may have to kind of come part of the way. Those of you in front, it's pretty easy. So, any raised hands? Back here? No.
Oh, over here.
Here we go.
Oh, there's Tommy.
Hey, Margaret.
Hi, Tommy.
Congratulations on completing this journey. I mean, it's amazing because I feel like I've known you basically the whole time, almost the whole time that you've been working on this book. So congratulations. I've not had a chance to read it. I'm excited too. And my question is, maybe this is not necessarily a central theme to the book, but I was really kind of struck by your description of not feeling any sense of community, Asian or Korean American community growing up in Houston. Not surprised at all by that, because I know you well enough, and I've heard the stories of growing up in suburban Houston, and not surprised that you wouldn't have had that community there. But I am surprised that you didn't find that at maybe UT or NYU journalism school, and that only when you arrived in California did you find that.
Yeah, when I went to University of Texas at Austin, there was not an Asian American Studies department in the 80s or 70s. There wasn't even an Asian Studies department until the 90s. So, and there were very few Asian Americans around. I mean, there were, I was pre-med for 3 years, and there were Asian Americans in pre-med, but not in art history, which is what I switched to. But I never felt part of that. Like I didn't feel like it was quite an identity in Texas in the 80s. I don't think it was in California, because that's where the whole Asian American, studies started in at Cal. But it wasn't part of my college at all. So when I first moved to the Bay Area in 1992 to work at SF MoMA, and so that was the first time where I had, more than one friend who was Asian American. So it was kind of a revelation to me.
Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Martin.
It's so great to see you sitting there
Oh, thank
for
you.
all these years. I never asked you this, of like all the conversations that we had about you writing this book and the knowing so much about the history of what you told us, but I'm really interested in the interview process with your admitted limited grasp of Korean. And I'm assuming that your mother was acting as an interpreter,
Right.
and then these conversations being recorded, and then did someone translate them for you afterwards, or how did that all work?
You're right. So my mother translated my questions, and then my grandmother answered in Korean. And I can understand, some Korean. I can barely speak, but so my understanding of the language is very one-sided. But I could also really concentrate on what my grandmother looked like. And like, yes, facial expressions. At first, everything was in a monotone. And it was almost like she was a robot, like reciting things, and it was very weird. But it was just interesting. Like, the more she got into it, the more emotional she was, or expressive she was. So it kind of gave me a chance to focus on these nonverbal cues. But yeah, my mother ended up translating everything for me, and in Microsoft Word. And my parents were translators for me for a lot of this book. The records that I found of my grandfather's were written in classical Japanese, which is a language that not many people know. Not even people in Japan, because it's classical. But my parents knew. Actually, my mother was the great language person in our family, so she could translate the classical Japanese interrogation records for me. And my father could do some too, but they were definitely partners in the whole research process. It was definitely a family project. I couldn't have done it without them. And when I was finishing the book, 2 years ago, my parents had passed away, and I had to find a translator for a lot of last minute research, and I realized, like, oh wow, this is like if I had to write the book now and not have my parents around, I don't think I could have done it. It's a lot of work to, if you're not fluent in the language. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Margaret. Hi, Catherine.
Congratulations. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about gender in terms of your research process, because in the scene, you begin the book with the reburial of your grandfather. You're talking about traditional gender roles where the men are engaging in part of the rite and the women are standing behind. And how easy or difficult was it as a woman in Korea accessing documents, being taken seriously, etc.?
Yes, it was difficult at first. When I first started research, I tried to just kind of fumble around with my really bad Korean. And I knew that the majority of professors that was speaking to had gone to graduate school in the US. So I knew that they knew English, but most of them would not speak English to me at all. And it was this weird, like, power play in a way. And I would be like, oh, like really trying my heart. My Korean was very bad. And what I realized was that they kind of dismissed me as this, like, oh, who's this, Korean American girl, whatever, who can't even speak Korean very well. But what I did was I hired a translator, and I presented myself as an American journalist from The Nation magazine, and, with the credentials first. And then they took me seriously because I had hired someone. And that was kind of a breakthrough. Yeah, it was interesting. But when I first met with the publisher, he did not take us seriously at all. My translator was also a young woman. And it wasn't until I brought my uncle with us, who could actually read classical Japanese, because I wanted him to look at the records, because I didn't know if they were real. I don't know. And then the publisher took me seriously and was very polite. But the time before, it was just me and my translator. He just was kind of like, you need to give me 500,000 won now. So it was very interesting, the gender issues in Korea. It's a very patriarchal country. Still is. Has changed some.
Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Sabrina.
So you have so much love in this room. And so many of us have been on this journey with you at different points. It's such a delight to be here and to see you read. I too was wondering about grief in the book, and I so appreciate how you framed that. There's so many ways in which grief is being processed in this book, and there's two questions that I have related to that. One is, just looking at the news recently and how far away reunification feels at this moment, processing the grief of the cleaving of this country as well, and wondering how that settles in for you, both in the writing of this book and in this present moment. And then just thinking, you started this journey and people were alive in the process, your grandmother, your parents. And how does that grief feel, especially at this moment, both the joy and the grief of the book being in the world? I'm thinking about that a lot and wondering how it's feeling for you.
It feels a little heavy. I mean, I wish my parents were here. But at the same time, like, writing about people who, when they're alive, is different than writing about when they're past. There's a little freedom there. But the newest parts of my book are the prologue and the epilogue, and those are set in 2019, which is after my parents had passed, and my family and we went to Korea to scatter my parents' ashes there. And we visit my grandfather's grave, and there's a full circle effect there. And that's part of the grief process, is to acknowledge your ancestors. So I think that's very important to, as a framing device, because the next generation, this is who the book is for. But yeah, it is a lot about grief, and unprocessed grief. When there's an absence, it's unprocessed because you don't know what you're grieving. It's that sense of intergenerational trauma. You don't know, you have your what's being passed down as an absence. So you can feel it, but you don't know what it is. Yeah. And I forgot your first part of your question. Okay. Oh, reunification. Yeah, I mean, it does seem very far away. And one reason I wanted to write this book is so people know that Korea was not divided in perpetuity. Like, people always ask, like, oh, is your family from North Korea or South Korea? I'm like, well, no, they're from Korea. Because when my parents grew up, there was one Korea, and for the most of history, Korea was one country, and it has thousands of years of history. And the division is very recent, and hopefully it won't last forever. But as I said before, the Cold War still exists.
Hi, Margaret.
Hi.
I heard you speak about this book on Friday when I met you, and I was moved by the story that you told about how, for your father, kind of learning that there was a different aspect to his father's story other than being a convict, and how that lifted, kind of this burden of shame from him late in life. And, I have to imagine he must have been in his 60s, 70s, or 80s at that point, and wondering how that was for you to kind of observe that change in your father, and whether you'd be willing to speak about that.
Yeah. So when my father discovered who his father was, his personality really changed. I think there was something lifted from him. And he was a very quiet, very stoic man growing up. Did not acknowledge emotions very, very much. And my mother was the interpreter of my father's emotions. She was like, your father's very upset, and like, we wouldn't really know unless he blew up or something. So it was either like, nothing or blow up. But after he discovered who his own father was, he became a gregarious, outgoing person. And I think that's who he really was inside. And we never saw that, growing up. And it made me really wonder, like, what he was like as a kid. Was he just this, like, kid who ran around and was, when did his spirit become dampened? Like when did that happen? And, after my father changed, my mother would complain. It's like, your father talks all the time. He will not shut up. It's like, what, like I did not marry this, super talkative, like, oh my God, I'm so tired. But he really, I'm so glad that I got to see that, the spirit of this man that, I grew up with, but now I knew who he really was. Thanks for asking that.
Anyone else? Okay, let me come around to you.
Hi, someone you don't know.
Oh, hi.
I'm looking at this through the lens of researching my Italian heritage.
Mm.
And in that heritage, the name of the family, the boys, the girls, as you pass them down, is very important. Can you talk a little bit about your family, whether or not your father received his father's name or the uncles did, and how that makes you think about your family now and the women too?
Oh, yeah. Actually, a friend of mine there's a family tree in my book, and my great grandfather or great great grandfather, his wife is Lady Han, because back in those days, women did not have names. They were Lady Lee, it's they. And my friend was like, why is she Lady Han? I was like, because there's, no name was given. So that's interesting. Also, I just want to mention that Sung Ya is Starry Field is the name of my book, and it's a translation of Sung Ya, which was the name my grandfather used with his comrades. So that's the name my father. There were letters my father saw as a child that were hidden in my grandmother's dresser that were addressed to brother Sungya. And when I heard that, I knew that had to be the title of my book. It's such a poetic, idealistic, beautiful name. But my son Owen here, the eldest son, his middle name is Sungya. So we named him after his grandfather, his Korean name. So
I
that's
think we have time for one more question. Anybody? Right here.
Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Rico.
I'm just sitting here in amazement, and I have so many questions, but my main question is, I'm just wondering how this whole process of research and writing and arriving to this moment has evolved you. And, how can you summarize the journey or share with us aha moments or epiphanies along the way that you feel has transformed you into who you are now?
Well, I think since it took me so long to write, like it part of the journey is in the book. I think I learned what it really means to be a mother from my grandmother, learning her stories and what she had to do to make sure the family survived. And that was her, that was her ethos. One of the themes of the book is that I have always wanted to have kids, since I was a young girl. And I always knew that. And I didn't quite know why. It wasn't coming from here. But I think there's some legacy there with my grandmother. And I didn't really understand it until I spoke to her. So that was, I think, maybe the biggest revelation, is to feel that bond with previous generations.
Well, we find ourselves at the top of the hour. Margaret, congratulations. What an amazing book. And Eirinie, thank you for doing the honors. And thanks to all of you online for joining us from all over the world. And we're going to have signed copies for those of you who have purchased them online. And for those of you in this room who would like a signed copy, you may purchase it at the front counter. And then we're trying to get everyone on this side of the room so we can kind of clear out the main space. That's all there is. Thank you so much.